Why did he walk away? Oh, he went and closed his door.
Shut my door.
I
I didn't know you were going to start.
thought you were leaving. I was like, well, okay. Well, okay. Are you ready?
Yeah, we can go.
You doing it without your headphones? Without your earbuds?
Oh,
headphones?
yeah. I would have realized it halfway through.
I wonder if they took away my admin for Okta.
I don't know. What is Okta?
They did not.
It is not what?
They didn't take away my admin for the most important system that the university uses. That I technically don't need access to. They didn't take my access one.
But they took your access from everything else.
Everything
Yeah,
else?
they just took everything else. They're like, we took that out. So I could have actually just gone in and turned my access back on, apparently. So, okay, y'all ready?
Whenever you are.
Welcome to the Toy Rewind Podcast with your hosts, the Brothers Newland. Now, let's talk toys.
And Niner. Hello, everybody. I'm Michael.
I was like, are you going to say your name? I'm John.
Niner? Isn't it Nanner?
Niner.
Oh, okay.
Episode 99.
Oh, okay.
Oh,
Yeah,
yeah, there you go.
Hey, everybody, I'm Andrew, and you're listening. If you didn't understand from the guy who did our very long intro, you're listening to the Toy Rewind Podcast with Brothers Newland. This is episode 99, as Michael was just talking, and it's going to be a little different than the others. We are not talking about one toy line. We're going to talk about the evolution of the toys. We're rewinding all the way back to 1920. We're going to start there. We're going to hit some decades. We're going to talk about some toys. We're going to have some fun with it. So hopefully you enjoy this and you stick around through the end. And you hear about episode 100 because we got information about that coming up. So you guys ready? John, you got to do your thing first. I don't know what I'm trying to rush into it.
You're like,
So
let's
sorry.
go toy. I mean, we could do
Yeah,
the
yeah,
social
yeah.
networks later or do them now. I mean,
Let's do it now. Just do it now. Do it now.
yeah, let's
Do
get
it
them
now.
done early so people know. That way, when they cut out, they still know where to find us. If they
Right.
cut out, hopefully they don't cut out.
Hopefully they don't.
All right, so check us out over on our website over at toyrewindpodcast.com, or you can check us out at crossthestreamsmedia.com. If you go to Cross the Streams Media, at the corner, there's a little microphone deal, and you can click on that and leave us a voicemail. It's very simple to do, very easy to get to. It's not that hard. It really doesn't take a lot of extra steps. So,
It does not.
yeah. And then you can email us at toyrewindpodcast@gmail.com. Instagram, Twitter, and Twitch is all Toy Rewind Pod. Facebook and YouTube is Toy Rewind Podcast. Michael's been doing his Motoring Mondays on there. I know we've got some traction with the YouTube show, so please keep that up and keep listening and watching or whatever. We'd love to see that. And of course, if you would love to play a game while you're listening to us, go to podcastbingo.com/Toy Rewind and play the bingo game that Andrew created for us and a lot of our other podcasters.
Bingo, bingo, bingo.
Bingo. All right. Now that we've gone through that, make sure you go through and you follow those socials because we're going to be dropping more and more information and some information about a couple giveaways we're doing for episode 100 because it's a pretty big deal. It's all 3 digits. It's finally the number that I've been waiting for since we started this whole thing. So we're going to do some good giveaways. So you want to make sure you're on those social medias. With that, you guys ready? You guys ready to talk about some toys?
Sure.
Yeah, we can.
All right.
Yep.
Michael?
I almost hit the intro again and not the rewind drop. So
that would have
luckily I didn't.
No, we're not going to start over.
All right. Let's let's rewind and get
Back it
into
up. Let's go.
There we go.
All right. So something we're gonna talk about. We're gonna go kind of decade by decade, over the last 100 years, and kind of just talk about a few lines here and there. Some of the most popular toys during those decades. Just something to talk about. We don't have, like I said, Andrew said before, it's not one particular line this week like we always do, but we'll get back to that on episode 101. But today we're going to, like I said, we're going to talk about each decade by decade. So you guys just chime in whenever. I'm just going to kind of introduce that decade, and then we'll just talk about some of the toys. So 1920s, the 1920s, it's just kind of the simple toys. You had things like Raggedy Ann, teddy bears were popular. They were actually started getting called teddy bears at that time. They had stuffed bears before and stuff like that, but they were actually starting to get called teddy bears after Theodore Roosevelt. Crayola crayons were big during the 20s. They were introduced, I think 1903, I believe, is when the Crayola crayons were invented or were created. But they really got big during the 20s. Lincoln Logs was another big one during that time. You had Tinker Toys. Another thing that came along that was kind of big during the 20s was yo-yos. I know
Yo-yos.
they had another resurgent back the 60s, and then back in the early 90s. Yeah, 90s, it was a big thing. Yo-yos have been kind of up and down over the years. So, but yo-yos actually go all the way back to the 2000 BC or something, way back then.
Oh, it was like way back to the 2000s.
Yeah, 4,000 years ago. But yeah, they've been around for that long. That's how long. But they weren't made of plastic. Plastic wasn't around back then. But anyway, that you had Twiddlywinks, which is a game they played back then. Radio flyer wagons, those were popular back then. Those were actually the precursor to that. Was a wooden wagon, and the guy that was making it, they decided to made them out of metal and named them Radio Flyer. So that's a couple things. That's some of the lines that they actually played with back then. The 20s, like I said, it's the simple toys back then. So go ahead.
I do like how on our list you have it listed as simple toys.
Yeah, that's all it was. Oh, another thing that's on there was 10 lithograph toys. These are like little 10 toys. Some of them you can actually had a little wind up little thing, and they would move around. But they were just simple little folded up 10 to look like a car or a train or a truck or animals, different things like that is what it was. It was just, and most of them were back then. They were hand painted. Later on into the 40s and stuff, they started coming up with the printing, the decals or whatever on there, the printer on it. But back then, most of them were all hand painted back then. So a lot of them didn't really move. There was a few that you could wind up and move, but most of those came later on into the 30s and 40s on those. So now. Let's move on into the 1930s. So you had the Great Depression during the 30s. So a lot of kids, a lot of families couldn't afford. They got to a point where they couldn't afford big toys, but there were some that you could buy. A lot of things that popped up in that era was board games. We talked about in our couple of our board game episodes, Monopoly, Scrabble, Sorry. Those were all games that became popular in the 1930s. So it was just something that the family could sit down and do to play together. Another thing, you had role-playing type games, toys to play with. Big big thing back in the 30s was Buck Rogers in the 25th century, stuff like that. They had little guns with a holster that you could wear, a little sci-fi looking gun. They had kind of the costume type stuff. It's all role playing type stuff that you use to play. You can pretend that you were Buck Rogers. Dolls was another big thing back then. Just cheap made dolls that's even the poor families could get a doll for the little girl or whatever. So they couldn't afford a lot of them, but most families had one or maybe two. Now, some of the other families that had a little bit more money, they could get educational type toys. You had, like we talked about a few weeks ago, the Rector sets. You can get microscopes. They had craft type toys where you make things out of beads. And then you had finger paints, which was another thing for back then. So that was a few things that you could get back in the 1930s. Like I said, there was a little bit of high dollar stuff, and there was a lot of cheap stuff back then because money was tight for everybody back then because it was the Great Depression, all that. So moving on into the 1940s, we got the World War II era right in there. So one thing that came out of the 1940s was some accidental toys, is what they're called. You had the Slinky, which was a guy was trying to invent some way to help transport equipment and stuff across seas on boats and give it some kind of stability on the boats where it was kind of rough on them. And they were trying to come up with some kind of spring type thing to keep them from jostling around on the boats. And then they came up, the guy accidentally knocked over what he had, and it kind of slinky down.
He knocked it off his desk, and it kind of walked down, and then he took it to his wife.
Yeah, I said, "Hey, look at this!"
I mean, isn't that what you do?
Yeah.
Take it to your wife. Yeah. You knock something off.
They got excited about it. That's actually in one of the documentaries, Toys That Changed the World, or Toys. I can't remember what it's actually called, but I watched it. So that and a lot of other, like the Frisbee and stuff like that, were also on this documentary. But that was something that it wasn't intended to be a Slinky. It was intended to be something else.
Right. Interesting how that happens, though. A mistake, and all of a sudden you got a toy.
Yeah.
Intended to be a large spring.
Yeah, I mean, it was supposed to be something to support, equipment going across seas, and this ends up being a toy, So, something else that was like an accidental toy was Silly Putty. That was actually supposed to be they were trying to, during World War II, or Japan occupied most of the countries that produced our rubber supply. And so what we were trying to do, the U.S. was trying to do, was try to find a replacement for rubber, for like making up a synthetic rubber for like rafts and tires and vehicle and aircraft parts and stuff that they need. And one of the guys, there's two different kind of stories going on who actually created it, but the scientists that came up with this actually realized that it was the way it was flexible, but it would still kind of flow like a liquid, but then it wouldn't, and then it bounced when you kind of threw it on the floor, but it wasn't a suitable substitute for rubber, so they went on through trying to find the right thing, and then it ended up some lady that had a like a kind of little store or something had it for somehow she got a hold of it, and one guy, who was it? It was trying to find his name. I can't find his name right now, but I was looking at my notes. But so he ended up getting it because he saw potential in it, and then he ended up selling like 250,000 of these things. He put it in a little 1 ounce inside of a plastic egg, and he tried selling it, and it didn't sell very well, and then somebody saw it and they wrote a little article in the newspaper about it, and then he sold 250,000 of them in 3 days after that article. So
Jeez.
yeah, so the guy's name was Peter Hodgson. Can't say his name. He's the guy who actually started selling it, and then he ended up selling it to somebody else later. So I think it was I don't remember. I can't find my notes, so don't worry about that. We'll come across it later on in another episode, all the details of this. But yeah, that's just something that was accidentally created, and it ended up being a toy.
I mean,
yeah. So
Fun.
yeah. A couple other things, since it was World War II, war toys for boys were popular. You had toy guns. We talked about Green Army Men. Green Army Men were popped up in the 40s. That was something that came up. The girls also had more nurturing toys for the girls. They had their dolls. They had doll houses. They had paper dolls were starting to become pretty big in the 40s. Something else that also the first use of electronic games was actually started or first introduced during the 40s, but the electronic wasn't like what we know now. It didn't have any like electronic circuits or anything like that. If it had like a light that would come on or something like that, they just called it was electronic because the light blinked or whatever on it. So it wasn't really electronic.
that's all it takes. Just one little light blinking.
Yeah. Tonka trucks were big back then. Let's see, Legos. We talked about Legos. Legos showed up in 1949, the end of the decade after World War II. And then going back to games, Candyland came out in the 40s as well. So that's pretty much the 1940s. The 1950s. So the 50s were post-war. This was a time of peace and leisure, allowing families to splurge on whatever they wanted to. Back then, TV sets were starting to get big in households. This actually starts seeing the beginning of advertising on TV.
And when you say big, you mean the cabinets were large and the screens were small.
Yeah. It wasn't a big screen TV. It was a small screen TV with a big cabinet around it. Yeah. But it was a big fad. Everybody was starting to pick those up here and there. Right. Back in the 40s, there wasn't hardly any TVs out there. And in the 50s, it started picking up. They 20s and 40s, they had radio shows. They advertised stuff on there. Like you see, if you ever watched Christmas Story during Christmas time, Christmas Story where they're sitting in front of the listening to the little orphan Annie show, and with his decoder ring and stuff like that. So they actually did have some kind of advertising, but it really wasn't towards the toys. It was just something you got the decoder ring to use to figure out something else, that drink more Ovaltine, stuff like that. But
more Ovaltine.
Yeah. So TV. So actually, the first type of toy advertisement on TV was actually during the first episode of the Mickey Mouse Club. So they actually wanted to they had all these companies. They wanted these companies to provide $500,000 so they could produce the show, and they would do advertising for these shows. And really, the only one that took them up was Mattel. So Mattel actually they advertised their burp gun is what it was called, burp gun. I don't know exactly what a burp gun does. I guess I don't know if it makes burping noises or what, but that seemed kind of awkward back in the 1950s. You had a gun that burped. So
yeah.
I don't know.
Sounds like a minion gun that you see at Walmart.
Yeah. I think it was like a cap gun is what it was. So so that's what they did. Mattel spent $500,000 on the Mickey Mouse Club to advertise their cap gun. So
There you go. Okay.
so that starts, and then later when we get into more advertising down the road, that kind of starts the snowball effect of the advertising part for toys. So that was 1955, and I think, if I remember right, it aired on the day Dad was born, that same day. So
Interesting. Shout out
Yeah.
to that.
Shout out to Dad.
shout out to Dad. It was in November of 1955. Or October. Is it October?
I was going to say, I think
It's
Dad was
October.
born in October.
October. I don't know why I said November. October.
So did
1955.
did this actually go on Dad's birthday that Dad was born or not?
Yes. When I watched the first episode, it said it aired on his birthday in 1955.
Okay.
October. I don't know why I said November. It was October. Sorry, Dad. So
Michael doesn't know for your birthday.
yeah,
Some of us know when your birthday is.
I do too. I just said the wrong month.
Week after Mom's.
Yeah. So, so that getting into that, also you have better advancements in plastic for manufacturing. So they're starting to move away from kind of more metal or whatever pieces. They can get to cheaper with the plastic. They can make more product at a cheaper price with the plastic than you could with the metal. Another thing for the 1950s, big point on this was they had imagination toys like robots and space themed type things. That was big during the 50s. You had cowboys and Indians during that time too, and that kind of reflected on the TV shows that were out at that time. There was a lot of westerns in the 50s and 60s. You had a lot of people talking about space and stuff like that through the 50s and 60s. So that all influenced a lot of the toys during that era. So a couple of things that were popular during that time. The Magic 8-Ball came out that year or that decade. The Little People, the little plastic Little People came out. Mr. Potato Head, which was actually a real potato. You can use any kind of fruit. You just bought the pieces to stick into the fruit or vegetable, or whatever you wanted to make.
Or a tortilla.
That's what or if you want to stick it through a tortilla, whatever. So Play-Doh came out as well. That's another accidental toy. That was more of a cleaner, I think, at first.
It was a cleaner for wallpaper.
Yeah. So they this I think a teacher contacted them wanting some kind of non-toxic type thing that the kids can actually use to do something with, and they sent her that, and then rest is history for Play-Doh. So that's one of those toys that was created for something else other than being played with. Hula hoop, those got big in the 50s. Modeling kits, that was a big thing through the 50s and 60s. You build your own car, build your own airplane, whatever you want to do, you can build it. Those are again getting kind of big now. Again, just having that little cycle through right now. I know a lot of people that buy and build these kits now. I know I built my share of them back in the 80s growing up. Let's see what else. Matchbox cars, those were big back then as die-cast cars. Pogo stick was big. Frisbee, that kind of goes along with the hula hoop. Color forms, those little you stick it on there, and the kids had fun with sticking those on the background, and then you can actually peel them off and put them change them around, whatever you want to do. A couple other big things that came out was skateboards. That was the beginning of skateboards right then. So And then the biggest thing, the biggest toy that came out of the 50s was Barbie. And you go back and watch our episode on that to get the history on that. But that was one of the biggest. Was 1959 she came out.
Yeah.
That kind of defined going into the 60s with a lot of dolls and some of the stuff we're going to talk about in the 60s. So, y'all got anything else on the 50s y'all want to put in? No.
No.
No, they did marketing for Barbie on the Mickey Mouse Club too.
Mm-hmm.
Really?
Yes.
Okay. Interesting.
Yeah. Again, that's Mattel. So Mattel put their money in for Mickey Mouse Club. So, and I think they got their money's worth out of that.
Oh yeah, I'm sure they did.
So, moving on into the 1960s. So, this is the introduction of the action figure. Came out in this time. You had G.I. Joe. That's what it was. The 12-inch G.I. Joes. Before that, there really wasn't an action figure. Barbie came out. It was dolls and stuff like that, and they wanted something for the guys, but they didn't want a doll. They wanted to call it something else, so they called it action figure. So that's what they got. Okay. There's a lot of big things came out in the 60s. You had Etch-a-Sketch, Easy Bake Oven, Nerf. That's one of our first episodes there. Early episodes for us. Nerfs, you can throw it at whoever you want to, and it won't hurt nobody. You throw it in the house, it won't break anything. Hot Wheels came out in 1968. That kind of revolutionized the diecast market. Matchbox was big, and it kind of did good for the diecast market. And then Hot Wheels, Mattel upped the ante on that and made them even better. Troll dolls from the 60s. Chatty Cathy. Light Bright was another one that came up with the lights and stuff. You can make pictures and lights. A couple of games that came out during the 60s that we've talked about before: Operation, Twister, Battleship, Rock'em Sock'em Robots was another big one back then. And then one that I always had fun with, Super Mini Balls, the bouncy balls. You just bounce it and it just goes all over the place. So those are always fun to do. But the biggest things that came out of the 60s, you had the action figure of G.I. Joe. You had his Action Jackson and all kinds of different action figures that I don't want to say features, action figures that come out during that time. Right after that, so a lot of people were trying to mimic that success that Hasbro had with that. So the 60s was a big time, big decade for the toys. You can see things starting to ramp up in the toy industry. Like I said, the 20s were simple stuff, and then they just kept getting a little bit better as technology started going, as far as the better plastic advancement in plastic for manufacturing, stuff like that going on through the decades. Things started getting better. People were getting a bit more ideas. Hey, toys are a big industry. Let's get into it. Stuff like that. So 1970s. Are y'all good with 60s?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, the 60s has some of the games that you were just mentioning, fun stuff. So that's like, to me, I mean, you've got the Legos and stuff that started before that, but that to me is where that's the biggest jump for amazingness. Not just, we have metal to use and a little bit better this. Like they were doing some really cool stuff in the 50s. I guess some of that came from the late 40s, but yeah, that's the biggest jump for me.
Okay. So 1970s. This is where we get into a lot of even more cooler stuff than what we were doing. More advancements, more ideas. So one thing that I should have said before we got started was toys toys help build imagination, creativity. They help define your motor skills, refine your motor skills as you grow. It gives you can give you self control. It helps kids grow into adults, and a lot of those kids don't really act like adults when they get older because they love to play with stuff. So, I mean, that's a good thing. And as adults, with the collecting aspect, like me and Andrew and John, you've got into it the past couple of years. It kind of takes you away from your everyday stresses and stuff like that. That's the way I look at my collecting habits. But the toys are they're just like I said, they help you grow into the person that you are. So, so moving on into the 70s. So we actually get real electronic toys for this decade. There's licensed toys from movies, TV shows, comics. You get all that kind of stuff in this decade. You get so some of that stuff you get Universal monsters are big. They were big in the late 60s and through the 70s. That was a big thing. We talked about that on several other episodes we had before. Another thing that was going on was you had the stunts of Evel Knievel. Kids wanted to be that stunt man, so there was an Evel Knievel stunt cycle that you can buy. So you can live as a stunt guy through that without even getting hurt. So you had Baby Alive, so the girls can act like they're a real mom. You feed the baby, the baby poops or whatever it does. So the girls can actually pretend to be a mom for this. It kind of helps you. Like again, it helps you learn how to grow. So, $6 Million Man came out during the 60s or the 70s. Sorry, the 70s. Stretch Armstrong was a popular toy back then. It was full of corn syrup, so if you ever busted one, it got stuff all over the place. There was the Pet Rock. That was one that lasted for a short period. It was really big, and then it faded. So I think it had like a 3 or 4 month period of a lot of sales all of a sudden. This guy put rounded rocks in a box and sold it to you for $4. So 3 or 4 bucks.
I think that's great. So, I bet he didn't pay much for him.
Rock.
Yeah, he made quite a bit off of those little rocks. So some games that actually came out during that time. You had Hungry Hippo, Connect 4. You had Rubik's Cube came out in the 70s, and that was supposed to be more of an educational thing, and it ended up being a puzzle solver thing. It was one of those things that was actually intended for something else. Something I remember growing up with in the 80s was Shrinky Dinks. They were popular in the 70s. You color your little figure, your little plastic piece, and you stick it in the oven and it shrinks. And then you have a little hard piece of plastic with your decoration or character on it, whatever you got.
I remember doing Shrinky Dinks. I remember doing Shrinky Dinks with Nanny a lot.
Yeah, I think we did it. So you may have. I just remember doing it at home with Mom. You may have done it.
Maybe by the time I was there. Yeah.
Nanny.
Maybe by the time I was around, Mom's like done with Shrinky Dinks.
Maybe so.
So Nanny.
A couple other, smaller kids. You had Weebles. We talked about Weebles. Playmobil was another one for kids. Mattel had their slime. It was a little bit different than your Nickelodeon slime, but it was big in the 70s. So it was a green slime. And then we saw some stuff, the action figures. I don't know why I can't say that tonight. Action figures actually got shrunk. So the 60s were action figures 6-inch action figures. These actually got shrunk to 3 3/4 inch. So you had Star Wars. That was one of the biggest lines of the late 70s was Star Wars. You had Micronauts. Those were some small ones. Some of the like I'm talking about earlier, the license with the TVs, movies, comics. Those were Mego characters. You had all your DC characters. You had your Marvel characters. You had all your like Starsky and Hutch. You had all those kind of big TV times right there. They had all the characters and figures and stuff like that through Mego. Then you had another toy line, the Azrak Hemingway. We mentioned about them as well in our Universal March and our Monsters episode. They did about the same size as Mego did on those big ones. So those were they were about mid 70s as well on the Mego characters. But when Star Wars came out, they kind of revolutionized the toys, the action figures to be smaller.
They also revolutionized giving away an empty box for Christmas, but
yeah, first Christmas you got an empty box. Let's see. Again, what I said the very first when I mentioned the 1970s, you actually saw real electronic toys. So this is getting into video games. So you had Pong was the first one, and then they came out with the Atari 2600. Which is actually Pong, the little game Pong. It was one console and that was just one game. That's all you could play. When the Atari came out, you had different cartridges. You could play different games on it. It did have Pong, but you can change it out to something else. So they were pretty simple games then. Then they got a little harder as you got into the 80s, but that's something that came out was the Atari 2600. Then you had some handheld electronic games. Mattel had some, like a football game and some other. I think they had their own version of the baseball, stuff like that. So Mattel had some handheld games as well. Simon came out with the blue and yellow and green and red spots that you have to hit and whatever pattern
Simon
it says. Yeah, well, it's not Simon Says, but it's Simon. So
Simon says do this, so you do it.
Yeah, so you do it.
Still Simon Says.
And something else that came out that we actually had, Speak and Spell came out in the late 70s as well. So you had your Speak and Spell, you had your math one, and then there was another one. There was 3 different ones, 3 or 4 of them. So that's something that came out. So 70s actually didn't help you spell. So the 70s were big. We're starting the electronic craze, which we start seeing throughout the 80s and 90s as well. We'll get into the 1980s. You guys good with 70s? We'll move on into the 80s.
Yeah, time to get into mine and John's wheelhouse.
So yeah, this is kind of all 3 of us kind of wheelhouse. I had a few things from the 70s, but not much. Most of it's all 80s for us. If you kind of tell in our, and we're trying to get out of that a little bit into other decades as we do our episodes, but a lot of our episodes leading up to today were 1980 toys from the 80s. We have done some earlier ones and we've done some 90s, but the 80s is our wheelhouse. So the 1980s, the toy lines, you had toy lines that had cartoons. The cartoons was the ultimate advertising. So that's where I was getting into the advertising thing at first, and then it moved, and now we've got a 30-minute advertising commercial for a toy. And
5
really
a week. Like 5 a
lot
week.
of them were 5 a week. Yeah.
Yeah.
So video games get better after after the video game crash in the early 80s. So, you know, they were good in the 80s, early 80s, and then it crashed. And then we see a resurgent from mid 80s and a couple years later, and it gets even better after that. Another thing that happened during the 80s, you had the return of the original action figure. Still can't say that. The return of the original action figure, but it's smaller and bigger. They reused Japanese transforming toys and adjusted those for American kids. And then you had greeting card characters that were brought to life as toys. And then you also had a doll that had adults fighting over it. So those are some of the highlights, the headlines of the 80s.
Yeah.
Kind of wraps all that up. So we get to the first part that I said, the return of the original action figure, but smaller and bigger. We get G.I. Joe back. But it's because of the success of Star Wars, G.I. Joe goes to the same size. But they're more articulated, they have more movement. You know, the original G.I. Joe had a lot of articulation to it. It was 12 inches. The smaller ones, I said bigger. They're smaller, but they're bigger is because the line got bigger. That line lasted all the way into the early 90s, and they added so many figures to it, so many vehicles to it. They had so much stuff added to that line that it was just so. G.I. Joe was huge, and again,
we had to break G.I. Joe into 2 episodes just to talk about them.
Yeah. So
I mean,
it was, there was a lot of stuff going on with G.I. Joe. You had a couple other things. You had Motu, Masters of the Universe came out. The Japanese toys, transforming toys that adjusted for American kids, that was Transformers and GoBots. If you want to throw them in there, Rock Lords, part of the GoBot line. So they were just transforming toys over in Japan. Nothing, no big deal. Late 70s, early 80s. Kids bought it. It was a transform toy. You transform it from robot to jet or car or whatever it is, and then back again. So what they did was they brought it over here. Hasbro bought the Transformers and came up with the idea of Transformers. You know, they got rid of the Diaclone names and all those names that they had for that the Japanese Takara had for them. They gave them real names. They gave them a storyline to put them all into one thing because there was 2 different lines that they combined into Transformers. So they made the line, to me, they made it better than, I don't know how they wouldn't have sold very good if they were just a Transformer toy that had no backstory to it.
yeah.
So they put it with the cartoon series. They come up with that. They have comic book series go with it. They had all kinds of stuff going with it to put in a it's like your own soap opera type show for kids. You know, it's kind of the way I looked at it. And they always had a good, again, going back to G.I. Joe and Master Universe, all that kind of stuff. They always had a good thing to say at the end for you to learn from. So
the teaching lesson.
Knowing is half the battle, you know? Yeah.
You didn't have an 80s cartoon with toy line unless you had a teaching lesson at the end of the episode.
Yeah,
Why
right.
else would parents let their kids watch the show?
Yeah.
They got to learn something.
And
all
all
rots the brain.
The governing sanctions and stuff on it said you have to have some kind of learning lesson from it in order for it to be there, and it couldn't be like a 30-minute cartoon or 30-minute advertisement, which what it really was. Yeah, but they had to add something to make it a little bit different than that. So let's see, where was that? Cabbage Patch Kids, Cabbage Patch dolls were big. That was the one that I referenced to that the adults started fighting over. For the holidays, you know, they said, "Oh, I got to have it for my kid," and they were buying more than what they could get to the stores, and they started fighting, and they started people started selling them out of their trunk in the back alleys, and it was like drugs almost. It was just crazy that these adults were fighting over. I mean, they got in fights over it. They were rushing the store. As soon as they opened the door, they were rushing through the doors, trampling people just to get to this doll. So
Beginning of Black Friday.
yeah, I mean, it was
Basically,
yeah, pretty much. So, let's see where else we got. Talking about the greeting card characters. You had Care Bears, Strawberry Shortcake, Rainbow Brides, stuff like that for the girls, and some of the boys liked us too. We had Care Bears. My Little Pony is in that group, kind of sort of. Pound Puppies was another thing that was big. Some other toy cars that were big during the 80s. You had Stompers, the 4x4 trucks that had a little AA battery in it, and you turn it on and you go forward, you go backwards with it, stuff like that. So they had little foam wheels on them. Micro Machines. That's a huge one. I still have. I've got Micro Machines here. So
They were tiny.
They were tiny. They were micro.
They were micro.
And then talked about Star Wars getting into small action figures. Micro Machines made things even smaller, and the certain lines followed that later on. So you had, talking about Micro Machines, you also had. Let's see, I put it on here. Your like pocket-sized collections. You had Muscle, you had Army Ants, you had Monster in My Pocket. All those small type things. So, let's see what else we got. You got. That's 90s. Another cool one that I noticed on here. Koosh balls showed up during the 80s too. Those are little balls that were just kind of. Had little rubber fingers all over it, and actually Randy found one out in the parking lot the other day and put it in my truck, and it's rolling in the handle in my passenger seat. I'll see it roll back and forth every once in a while in the truck the last couple of weeks. So yeah, Teddy Ruxpin. We talked about Teddy Ruxpin. He's another one, another electronic type thing that came out during that time. Power Wheels was big. Glowworm. We talked about American Girl doll.
Yep.
That was a big thing. Came out in the 80s. A couple of games that we talked about. Trivial Pursuit and Pictionary were big. They came out in the 80s and really, really did good.
One of the other big games besides Monopoly and Risk for us was always Trivial Pursuit. I remember playing it a lot.
Yeah, we played it quite a bit.
I got like 2 or 3 different versions of it over here. So,
Yeah.
I'm actually better at the 80s than I am the 90s and the 2000s. Just interesting fact.
Yeah, I'm probably the same way.
I don't know. I don't know why. I just I don't know. I'm just better at
I'm
it.
sure. I remember more from the 80s than I do the 90s. I guess 'cause I had other things going on, a lot of stuff going on in the 90s.
I'm pretty sure I remember more from the 80s than I do yesterday.
Probably so, yeah. Couple other things that came out late 80s. Andrew's big thing, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles came out.
Oh.
And actually, they were from the comics, came out in the early 80s, and it took or 5-6 years later, then they have their own toy line and their cartoon. And then 1990, the movie came out. The first movie came out. I think it was 90. So Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles was another huge one that came out, and that actually carried on into the 90s, a lot of the 90s. We talked about that in our episode on that. Let's see what else came out that was big. Another thing that was big during the 80s was gross out toys. We talked about Mad Balls. You had Garbage Pail Kids, the Trash Bag Bunch, all those like that. those were kind of, they got big in the 80s, all that little gross out type stuff, and then again, going back to electronic type stuff, we mentioned Atari, all those kind of crashed in the early 80s. Well, by 85, Nintendo hits the market, and that just blew up. You had Nintendo, then you had your Game Boy came out as well in the 80s. That was another big. You take your game wherever you wanted.
And
even
when you say your game, you mean Tetris.
Tetris, yeah.
I mean, what else did anybody really play on a Game Boy? The original Game Boys. You played Tetris.
And there was some other,
maybe some Dr. Mario.
There was some other, later on, some other game handheld came out, but the Game Boy with the green pixelated screen outsold some of the other color screen type games. So everybody wanted a Game Boy. So that was something else that came out in the 80s. Another big thing from the 1980s, there's a lot of stuff from the 80s. You had gimmicky toy lines. So just about every toy line that came out had some kind of gimmick to it. And I know I made a list of toy lines that we've talked about over the past 2 years on this. And there's a lot of these have gimmicks. Just last week we talked about Starcom. You had the Magnalock and the power deploy systems on that. Your Sky Commanders had zip lines. Mm-hmm. Power Lords had those reversible bodies. It had the thumb on two thumbs on a hand. It was just turn his head around. You got another character there.
So, some of John's favorite ones, like Visionaries, and what's the other one? They were holograms.
You had Visionaries, and you had
what's the other one? I can only ever remember one of them.
Supernaturals. They had the Hest and the chest holograms. Your DC Superpowers had the action features on it. Your Marvel Secret Wars had your lenticular image on their shield. Yeah. Then you had, go back to Trash Bag Bunch. They had the disposable trash bags. You put it in water, it all bubbles up, and then you get your figure.
And the toy drops.
Yeah, and it falls. Silverhawks were metallic painted characters. Mask, you had your hidden features inside the vehicles and the play sets. Dino Riders, you had your motorized dinosaurs with those. Bionic 6, they had the clear bionic pieces on their bodies. And then the very first episode we ever did, Centurions, they had little peg holes all over them where you could put their weapons and their accessories. And everything just kind of plugged right on into them. So,
you mean episode 001, Centurions?
Centurions. And bring that up, Centurions is number 1, and who would think we're going to our century mark next week? So,
we probably should have waited and then for that episode.
Yeah, we should have. But there was, even Motu, Master Universe, had their gimmick where you twist them and he'd punch.
Yeah. They did
the battle action
shield?
The battle action. Yeah, on their chest. Yeah. So, I mean, there's all kinds of all the toys. Just about every toy line in the 80s had some kind of gimmick to it.
80s was all about the gimmicks.
Yeah, the gimmicks, the advertising, toy lines, everything like that. So, I was going to say something else, but actually that's in the 90s. So we'll move on to the 90s. You guys good about the 80s?
Yeah.
So the 90s, a couple of points for the 90s. You had more Black Friday craziness with some toys. Even better gaming came out. Mm-hmm. A lot of things went digital during the 90s. There was more anthropomorphism figures, toy lines, and there was even a movie about toys that came out in the 90s. So
it's sad. I was reading that and it took me a second. I was like, a movie about toys in the 90s. And I was like, oh yeah, it's Toy Story. Yeah,
Toy Story. Yeah. So a couple of things that people went crazy over in the 90s. We talked about Furby. people went crazy for Furby. They were selling Furbies online for $1,000, $1,300.
One of your favorite toys,
stuff
huh?
like that. Yeah, and those things still freak me out. So I don't want nothing to do with Furby. Another one that was big during the time, Beanie Babies. That was another one that we talked about, Beanie Babies. How people went crazy over that. And then another one that was almost as big as Cabbage Patch Dolls, Tickle Me Elmo. That was another one that everybody went crazy over. Had to have.
Terrifying.
They were fighting over Tickle Me Elmo. It was ridiculous when that came out. And
Even though we had Cabbage Patch Kids and Black Friday stuff was happening before that, Tickle Me Elmo is when I remember Black Friday. Like that was like the big start of it for me, remembering about that whole thing.
How
Buying
bad,
before
how bad
Christmas,
it was getting.
How crazy it was, and then all of a sudden nobody wants to have Thanksgiving anymore, and let's just have Black Friday start on Thursday. Tuesday.
Earlier and get more people, more sales and stuff like that. But yeah, Tickle Me Elmo, that was just crazy over that little stuffed animal, that Muppet that popped up and down from Sesame Street. So going back to better gaming during this time. Another some little cheap handheld games. Tiger came out with some Tiger games. You had more football and baseball and stuff like that. Yeah. You had other little car games, and I know I had a racing game, Tiger Electronics. They had other games, like I think there was can't remember. There was several different ones with different characters from TV and movies. Just little handheld, cheap little games. So that was they were out that time. They were big during that time. Super Soaker. We talked about Super Soaker coming out in the early 90s or 1990, and it just took the squirt gun, water gun stage by hand by the
Storm.
Yeah, that's what I meant by storm. And just splashed everybody with water. Yeah.
Okay.
So something else that was a big thing back in the I guess it was big in Hawaii back in probably the 20s and 30s, but Pogs. They would pull the little cardboard thing off the top of milk jugs, and the kids would use them to play games. Well, some teacher in Hawaii,
in Hawaii,
because they would take those little cardboard pieces that they used to seal up and kids would use that to play a game. Well, there was a teacher that actually wanted to show the kids how to do that back in the 90s or late 80s, early 90s, and she started getting those. Well, then it got bigger, and the kids started collecting those, and then all these other companies started putting their logos on them, and you had all different kinds of decorations on them. Even I saw one that had Beavis and Butthead on it. I mean, they were big in the early 90s. People weren't playing the game anymore; they were just collecting them. Is what it was. It's kind of like stickers. I mean, you collect your stickers. Pogs. I mean, that was a big thing back in the early 90s.
We did play also, which is part of how you collected.
You have to have your slammer.
You have your slammer and whatever. We had so many. It's whatever you knocked out of the circle, you kept.
Yeah.
You just, everybody would come with like 25 and you could go home with 100 easy. You just got to know how to play.
Yeah. Another big thing that came out in the 90s, Betty Spaghetti. That was another doll that came out. She had spaghetti like hair, and you can do whatever you want with it. She was a little scrawny, arms and legs that you can pose however you want to. There was another big thing Andrew was kind of into a little bit, sort of, kind of, was Power Rangers. Mighty Morphin Power Rangers came out. You can listen to our episode on that. So that was a big thing. Let's see what else came out. Talk about Micro Machines in the 80s and the smaller toys. Well, they carry on into the 90s. You had Polly Pocket and Mighty Max. Those were a couple things from the 90s. You had what I missed on here. So another thing I said, digital things went digital. A couple episodes we just had recently was digital pets. You had your Tamagotchis. You had your all those kind of little digital pets that we talked about. So that happened. Then getting into better video games, you had the Super Nintendo come out, and then you had Nintendo 64 come out, and you had Sega Genesis, and then you had Sega Game Gear. If you remember Game Gear, I remember it. We never had a Sega, and then you had PlayStation, which is still around now. So you got the big three now. You got PlayStation, you got your Nintendo, and then you have what's the other? Xbox.
I was wondering if you were going to get there.
Yeah. So, but the 90s, you had the Nintendo 64 or the Super Nintendo to start off with, and then the 64 and the Sega Genesis and then your PlayStation during the 90s. What else did I miss? Oh, the anthropomorphic lines I mentioned. We had Ninja Turtles come out. Well, there was a lot of other lines that came out to kind of ride the coattails of the Ninja Turtles. Barnyard Commandos. You had Biker Mice from Mars and Bucky O'Hare. Those were a couple of others that we've talked about. So that was the 90s there. There was a lot of other things. I know a lot of other anime type stuff came out and it started coming out in the 90s and early 2000s. But there was, like I said, there was a few of those from the 90s that started coming out. Y'all got anything else for the 90s? No?
No. I mean, the 90s was fun. The late 80s into the 90s, a lot of fun, but nothing. I don't think the 90s beat the 80s. We have better stuff, but I think the imagination that came out of the 80s, we wouldn't have had. Obviously, we wouldn't have had the 90s if it weren't for the 80s. But the actual toys and some of the imagination of things that we came out of the 80s beats the 90s out a little bit.
Yeah, I think one thing that connects the two is Turtles. About coming out in late 80s, and all the way into the 90s. You had your Turtles. Talking about the last 100 years, or actually we covered what we 80 years of that. We didn't really get into the 2000s and the 2020s, 2010s. But from 1920 to through the 1990s, I mean, you started out with little tin toys and Lincoln Logs and Raggedy Ann, and then you ended up with the Nintendo 64, Sega Game Gear, PlayStation, Sega Genesis. There's a lot of difference between what you had from the 20s to the 1990s. So.
Yeah, a lot happened. But within 80 years, I mean, I know we went from, people barely even knowing what a phone is, in a house to, cell phones within those 80 years and everything. But, still, like the toys, there's so much evolution within the toys just in those 80 years.
Yeah. The technology and stuff like that made it better. Again, it's your imagination, your creativity. I know people say video games don't really isn't really like a toy or whatever, but you got to use your imagination when you're playing that. You got to use if you're certain games, you got to think about what you're doing to make moves and stuff like that. It makes your mind think is a lot of that stuff. So
I definitely think that the video games are. I do fall into that. I definitely think video games fall into the toy category. Otherwise, we wouldn't have talked about Nintendo on here because it wouldn't have been a toy, whatever. But I think all of those, and those go into even more evolution with things, because we have things like the Tamagotchis and the Gigapets, and where they were at even after we had things like the NES and stuff, because the Tamagotchi and stuff, those came out so small and so much later than what the NES was. You think by that point, within 10 years, we'd have something really crazy, but no, they're just little 1, 2, or 3 button little toys that people love. So, I think that's just all part of the evolution there.
Going back, back to the Nintendo thing, the video game thing, we played a lot of Zelda. We do every once in a while still. But that's one reason why I like Zelda the most is you have the puzzles that you have to figure out, stuff like that. So that's what that is. And a lot of other games are exactly that. They just do it in different ways to make you think how to figure things out, stuff like that. So, but back in the 20s again, you had your Lincoln Logs, Tinker Toys. You had stuff that you had to use a lot of imagination to do. To play with that stuff, and all the way in the 80s, you got your imagination to play with your Motu figures, your GI Joe guys, your Transformers.
You take those cartoons that they gave us, and then you take the figures and you redo the cartoon and you change it, and you build your imagination to do even more than what the storyline that they've already given you. And then on top of that, you take things like the Legos and you build new stuff, and it's all about the imagination and just building. And that's to me, that's all toys are. That's creativity, imagination. It doesn't matter what it is, whether it's a car or it's a little metal figure, or I guess these are die casts. Whatever. Yeah, it doesn't move, but my imagination can make it do whatever I want it to do. Yeah,
you can still have fun with it.
Yeah.
And
that's all about taking you away from your everyday stress too. It helps.
Exactly.
Yeah. So.
And we got plenty of everyday stress.
Yeah. I got plenty.
We don't need any more of it.
So, but that's the 80 years right there.
Anything out of the 2000s that you just want to brush over?
No, I can't really think of anything big that came out of the 2000s. You had the Bionic stuff from Lego.
Yeah, I think the biggest things that were happening were just evolutions of things that we already had. Like the Nintendo and stuff just evolved, and you get better graphics and stuff like that. You evolve into more computer games with Halo and Xbox and all that stuff, and it's just
and now
and I'm sure there's plenty of toys that came out in the 2000s,
and all these toys that we've talked about over the past from the 1920s to now. If you go back to Target or Walmart, look down their toy aisle, you see the same stuff, retro versions of that. You can go down, look in Target. They have Lincoln Logs still.
Yep.
They have. You can still buy Radio Flyer wagons. You can still buy teddy bears everywhere. Raggedy Ann is still around. There's still Erector sets out there that you can buy. Going back to the role play from Buck Rogers. You got different other kind of role playing, but it all came from that time. It's kind of one of the first things that you did that had that. Hot Wheels. Hot Wheels is still big from the '60s. You still have Matchbox cars. Micro Machines just came out, a couple years ago. They reintroduced Micro Machines back into the toy industry.
There's so many things
you go back
that are
through
getting
this time.
redone.
They have new versions of Masters of the Universe, G.I. Joe. They have all this stuff that we've talked about from the 20s, the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. They're reintroducing those back now, and you can get the retro versions of that stuff. So, yeah.
There's so many things that are being retro these days. Like we've got the not supernaturals. Now I know the name of it. The superpowers. We've got that. There's just so many things, and it's because the kids grew up that loved those toys from the 70s, 80s, and even in the 90s. Like, we're getting some of that stuff too, and we love it so much. We want to see it. We want to get the things. Those superpowers right there are not nearly as awesome as these originals, but they're still really cool to have. Like, they've upgraded some things or whatever. I bought those for way cheaper than I could get the same things for the originals. Yeah. So we're getting ourselves the chance to have those childhoods again, because so many of our mothers sold our toys in garage sales. Not that I'm calling our mother out or anything. I'm just saying, lots of moms and dads sold so many toys in garage sales, and now we want our toys back. So yes, we're getting them back.
Yep.
What else? Right. Anything else we want to talk about? Like, I mean, we talked about so much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a lot of stuff. I mean, and that's just scraping the surface of that. I just named off, just did a little thing about each decade and the toys that came out, the big toys that came out. There are thousands and thousands of other toy lines that are out there that we didn't even mention.
Didn't even talk about.
One I'm looking at right now, Viewmaster, came out in 1939.
I was gonna mention. I forgot the Talk Boy that came out in 92, or 90, late 91, 92. It was 92. Mm-hmm. Yeah, all about Home Alone 2. Came into that whole thing, and it was huge, and then it disappeared. Nobody cared about it anymore. So it's just things like that are just crazy. So, well, with that, we're gonna wrap that talk, but I am gonna talk about episode 100. If you made it this far and you listened to all of our information about those toy lines, you're going to love when we talk about episode 100, because next Wednesday, September 14th at 8 p.m. Central. It's 8 p.m. Central. 8 Central, 6 Pacific. That's also 7 Mountain Time, my time. That's what MT stands for, by the way, my time. We will be doing a live episode 100 where we're going to answer a lot of questions, different things like what our favorite toy line is, what's the one thing we've learned the most about, different things like that about doing the podcast. And we're going to talk about some bits and pieces of different ones. Like we talked about a lot of stuff, but we'll go into a little more depth next week, and we'll answer some questions and hopefully have some voicemails to play for some people. So please go leave us some voicemails, what you think are your favorite toy lines. What have we talked about that we haven't talked about? We're going to be putting some stuff out on Twitter this week to kind of push that. Also, share the tweet that I just put out there that says that we're doing this live next week. Because if you do that, you'll get entered into a prize giveaway that we have different prizes that all of us are going to be doing, kind of giveaway. Mm-hmm. So it's all going to be live September 14th at 8 p.m. Central. That's 6 p.m. East or Pacific time. So maybe you want to know where our Twitch channel is, and that's John. What is our Twitch channel?
Our Twitch channel,
John.
Ooh.
Yeah.
Caught him off guard.
I caught him completely off guard.
Yeah. We haven't done a lot on Twitch here lately, but it is Toy Rewind.
It is Toy Rewind. So check that out, Toy Rewind. Check out our Instagram, whatever. Our Twitter, Instagram, all those. We'll have the links up and whatever. But yeah, hopefully you come and join us. We may have some people pop in. You never know. Some of our old guests that
Is that Toy Rewind Podcast on Twitch?
John's looking it up while he's figuring that out. So remember, that's episode 100, September 14th. So yeah, it's gonna be a lot of fun. I think it's gonna be a lot of fun.
Toy Rewind Pod.
Toy Rewind Pod.
Pod.
So it matches our Twitter because our Twitter is Toy Rewind Pod. So yeah, twitch.tv/Toy Rewind Pod. It's gonna be fun. It's just a week away. You guys ready?
Yep.
100 episodes.
100.
Who would have thought we
100.
made it that far? Who would have thought
Yep.
we made it that far?
Yep.
So,
That's
okay,
awesome
well,
if we've done anything live. So
yeah, well, that's what we're gonna do it big. We're gonna do episode 100 big. It's gonna be a big celebration. So, anything else you guys want to add before we wrap this one?
No, like I said, there's a lot of good stuff throughout the years. If you didn't grow up in those eras, like I said, there's a lot of retro stuff that's out there that's the same as back then. So
Yeah,
you can find those toys still.
all kinds of stuff out there.
Yep.
All right. Well, with that, until next week, episode 100. Can't wait. Thanks for listening to Toy Rewind, and as always, play on.
You've been listening to the Toy Rewind Podcast. Follow and join in the conversations at toyrewindpodcast.com.